Part 6. To this whole world and beyond. Until the Civil War, the United States had seemed a world of its own. It had been easy for Americans to imagine that they really did not need the rest of the world. The continent was so large, it offered so many different climates, you could find almost every crop or animal, almost every mineral, somewhere within the nation and its territories. When the first settlers called the American continent a new world, they were speaking the sober truth. Then, after the Civil War, more and more Americans discovered that America needed the world. The nation still wanted to import people by the millions, and it needed the outside world for many new reasons. American farmers, factory workers, and business people depended for their success on faraway customers and on the ability of Americans to deliver their goods overseas. American consumers began to rely on silk from Italy and China, rubber from the Congo and Sumatra, coffee from Brazil, tin from Malaya, gold from Zimbabwe, and 1,000 other items from across the ocean. The United States became the world's center of expertise for trying new ways of making and doing, and people everywhere expected to learn from America. Americans began to feel it was their duty to help make the whole earth into a new world. But could the United States preach democracy and help other nations become democratic without trying to choose other people's governments for them? Could Americans take their place in the world competition for customers and for raw materials without making remote peoples into new kinds of colonies? Could the most powerful nation on earth resist the temptation to run the affairs of people everywhere? Could the nation do its duty in the battles of the old world and yet stay free of the old world curse of endless wars? Could the nation become the most modern, most intricately organized people on earth, and yet preserve self-government and the spirit of adventure? Chapter 30. Ocean Paths to World Power. After the Civil War, Americans realized that the United States had become a two-ocean nation. The Atlantic seaboard looked eastward toward Europe and Africa. The far western states looked across the Pacific towards Australia. Some Americans were beginning to think differently about their place in the world. An Annapolis graduate, Admiral Alfred T. Mahan, wrote a powerful book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890. What Uncle Tom's Cabin was to the Civil War, Mahan's sea power became to the Spanish-American War. Sea power, Mahan said, was the key to all history. A nation became great and kept its greatness only if it ruled the waves. Americans, he said, had long shown the instinct for commerce, bold enterprise, and in the pursuit of gain, and a keen sense for the trails that led to it. Yet these were not enough. The nation also needed to be rich in all kinds of ships. Then, of course, she would need colonies in faraway places where her ships could refuel and find protection. After a few years after Mahan began preaching about the sea power, he found one of his strongest allies in Theodore Roosevelt. President McKinley appointed Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. Even before he finished at Harvard, Teddy began writing a book called The Naval War of 1812. He was able to get it published in 1882, only 2 years after he graduated. Roosevelt remained fascinated by ships, and the puzzle of power especially intrigued him. What makes a nation strong? Mahan's answers delighted Roosevelt. In 1890, trouble brewed only a few miles off the coast of Florida. The island of Cuba had been a colony of Spain since Columbus first sighted it in 1490s. But by the 1800s, the Cubans came to the conclusion that Spain was oppressing them, and so Cuban rebels declared Cuba's independence from Spain in February 1895. The Spanish government sent out troops and put the island under a ruthless general, Valeriano Butcher Weyler. On February 10, 1896, General Weyler ordered that all the inhabitants of the country who were still outside the town should concentrate themselves in the towns. His troops would shoot anyone outside a town. This made Cuban towns into concentration camps. The whole island became a prison. The Spaniards herded men, women, and children together. They tortured some while they let others die of disease and starvation. Some of those who died were United States citizens. American newspapers splashed the stories of Butcher Weiler's atrocities on their front pages. These went out in the 6 editions of the papers that went out each day to the cities, and at least in the once-a-day editions that went out by RFD to remote farms. Joseph Pulitzer, an energetic Hungarian immigrant who had bought the New York World, was anxious to make his paper popular. The more copies he sold, the more he could charge for advertising, and advertising supported the paper. Pulitzer was brilliant at finding new ways to attract readers. For example, he hired a clever cartoonist, Richard F. Outcault, to make the first color cosmic strip. It showed the adventures of a bad boy called the Yellow Kid, who appeared regularly in the Sunday edition. Outcault's cartoons were so successful that Pulitzer's leading competitor, the go-getting William Randolph Hearst, hired the same cartoonist to do another Yellow Kid series for the Sunday edition of his paper, the New York Journal. While on Sundays both papers used the Yellow Kid to attract readers, every day they competed by printing shocking stories. They were more interested in whether the stories were shocking than whether they were actually true. Because they featured the Yellow Kid, people began to call these newspapers, and others like them, the Yellow Press, and they referred to their wild stories as yellow journalism. The United States had a long-standing interest in Cuba. Back in the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson himself had said he hoped to see Cuba become part of the United States. By the 1890s, American businessmen had invested over $50 million in Cuban sugar. In 1895, the rebels destroyed sugar plantations and mills. They hoped to prod the United States to intervene, and in 1896, as he campaigned to become the U.S. president, William McKinley promised to help Cuba become independent. He won the election, and Spain began to negotiate with the United States about the freedom for the Cubans. At first it seemed there would be no need to fight, but on February 9, 1898, the New York Journal printed a stolen letter in which the Spanish ambassador called President McKinley a coward and other nasty names. To protect American lives and property, the United States had sent the battleship Maine to Havana Harbor. At 9:40 in the evening of February 15, 1898, an explosion shattered the Maine. 260 officers and men died. The Navy's Court of Inquiry reported that an underwater mine was to blame, but they could not say for sure whether the Spanish were to blame. But it didn't matter who was at fault. The Yellow Press called for war against Spain and headlined the slogan, "Remember the Maine." When Theodore Roosevelt, the excitable Assistant Secretary of the Navy, heard that McKinley was hesitating to go to war, he said that the president had no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. And then on February 25th, the Secretary of the Navy made the mistake of taking the afternoon off. That left impatient Teddy as acting secretary in charge of the whole United States Navy. Without consulting anyone, he instantly cabled his friend, Admiral George Dewey, who commanded the United States fleet in Asiatic waters, making sure he ordered that Spanish ships do not leave the coast of Asia. Begin defensive operations against the Spanish colony out there, the Philippines. When the Secretary of the Navy returned to his office the next day, he was astonished. "Roosevelt," he wrote in his diary, "has come very near causing more of an explosion than happened to the Maine." But it was too late to change the order, and even before war had begun in nearby Cuba, Teddy had arrayed the United States fleet for war on the other side of the world. If President McKinley had been a stronger man, he would not have been afraid to keep the peace. The government of Spain now actually told him they would give Cuba her independence, but the Yellow Press was still demanding Spanish blood. And the Jingos, people who wanted to see a fight, were happy to do whatever they needed to start a war. On April 11th, the day after President McKinley learned that Spain would agree to do everything Americans said they wanted, he asked Congress to declare war. The war lasted only a few months, but that was long enough to create the greatest confusion. At the training camp in Tampa, Florida, commanding officers could not find uniforms, while for weeks 15 railroad cars full of uniforms remained on a siding 25 miles away. The commander of the United States troops in Cuba, Major General W.R. Shafter, weighed 300 pounds and was therefore too unwieldy to get to the front. Unprepared for combat, the Army committed every foolishness known to man. The Navy was in better shape. On May 1st, Admiral Dewey followed Roosevelt's impulsive orders, attacked the Spanish warships in the Philippines. He finished off the Spaniards in 7 hours. The remnant of the Spanish fleet, which was in North American waters, then sneaked into Santiago Harbor on the southern tip of Cuba. Meanwhile, Teddy Roosevelt had himself appointed lieutenant colonel of a new regiment of cavalry. At a training camp in San Antonio, Texas, he gathered cowboys, sheriffs, and desperados from the west, and a sprinkling of rich polo players and steeplechase riders from the east. This hodgepodge group soon took the name Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Roosevelt himself prepared for serious combat. What worried him the most was his bad eyesight. If he broke or lost his glasses, he would not be able to see where he was going, much less find the Spaniards to shoot. He ordered a dozen extra pairs of steel-rimmed glasses, and then stowed them separately all over his uniform and even put several extra pairs inside the lining of his campaign hat. On June 22nd, Roosevelt's Rough Riders arrived in Cuba. They took the job of storming San Juan Hill, which overlooked Santiago Bay. To capture the steep hill, his Rough Riders, who had been selected for their horsemanship, actually had to get off their horses. "I waved my hat and went up the hill with a rush," Roosevelt recalled. After a bloody fight, they reached the top. Theodore Roosevelt never suffered from modesty. When he published his book, The Rough Riders, the humorist Mr. Dooley said Teddy should have called it Alone in Cuba. The decisive naval battle occurred even before the Americans could place their big guns on San Juan Hill to bombard the enemy navy below. When the Spanish fleet tried to run for the open sea, the United States Navy exterminated every last one of Spain's warships. All over the United States, enthusiastic Americans celebrated their victory. By the standards of American history, this had certainly not been a full-sized war. There were 385 deaths, less than 1/10 of the deaths in the American Revolution, and only 1/20 the deaths at the Battle of Gettysburg alone. While the American Revolution had lasted nearly 8 years and the Civil War had lasted 4, the Spanish-American War lasted only 4 months. Even this little war cost $250 million and several thousand deaths from disease. And the little war marked a big change in the relationship of the United States to the world. The tides of history were turned. Cuba became an American protectorate. Though officially independent, she was actually dependent on the United States for military protection. Spain forfeited to the United States an empire of islands, and the United States, a nation born in a colonial revolution, now had her own colonies. All were outside the continent, some were thousands of miles away. The United States acquired Puerto Rico at the gateway of the Caribbean. It acquired Guam, which became important as a refueling station in the mid-Pacific, and Spain also agreed to sell the Philippine Islands, all 7,000 of them, to the United States for the bargain price of $20 million. These new American colonies added up to 100,000 square miles, holding nearly 10 million people. That was not much compared to the vast empires of England, France, or Germany, but for the United States it was something quite new. This Spanish-American War in American history then meant less in terms of what it accomplished than what it proclaimed. The American Revolution had been our war of independence. Now the Spanish-American War was the country's first war of intervention. The United States had joined the old-fashioned race for empire on all the oceans of the world. Many Americans worried. Some were sad, even angry. They called themselves anti-imperialists. They hated to see the United States become an empire. To be an empire, they said, meant lording it over people in faraway places. Anti-imperialists included Democrats and Republicans of all sections and all classes. Labor leader Samuel Gompers, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, university presidents Charles W. Eliot of Harvard and David Starr Jordan of Stanford, the philosopher William James, the social worker Jane Addams, and the popular writer Mark Twain. Theodore Roosevelt, however, believed that in the United States should accomplish her mission only if she was a great world power. "We must be willing to have colonies," he said, "while we help the people learn to be democratic." He built a great navy. During the Spanish-American War, just 2 years before he became president, the United States had only 5 battleships and 2 armored cruisers. But before Roosevelt left the White House in 1909, the country had 25 battleships and 10 heavy cruisers. It had become, next to the British, the strongest naval power in the world. President Roosevelt foresaw some grand accomplishments that stay-at-homes would never have done. For years, Americans headed west and had tried to find ways to shorten the voyage to California. Now, as a world power, the United States had to be able to move its navy speedily from one ocean to another. This created an urgent new reason to cut a waterway through the Central America. When Teddy Roosevelt came to the White House, a French company had been working on a canal for 20 years, but tropical disease had stymied them. Their progress was slow, and international complications seemed to make the whole enterprise hopeless. Teddy Roosevelt would let nothing stop him. First, he tried to make a treaty with the little Republic of Colombia. At that time, Colombia included the only part of the Isthmus of Panama where a canal could be built. When the government of Colombia blocked Roosevelt's treaty in 1903, a revolution suddenly occurred in Panama. A lucky coincidence for the United States, or was it? There is good evidence that American money helped the coincidence to happen. As soon as the revolution occurred, the new independent Republic of Panama made a treaty granting the canal zone to the United States. Within only 10 years after the construction began, ships began passing through the canal. The canal cost over $500 million. Building the canal produced some worldwide benefits that even Teddy Roosevelt never dreamed of. In order to build the canal through the fever-infested swamps, the Americans had to conquer tropical diseases. When Americans occupied Havana after the Spanish-American War, Dr. Walter Reed discovered the mosquito that carried the deadly yellow fever. Then Dr. William Gorgas, who had worked with Reed in Cuba, applied this discovery in Panama. His work finally made the canal possible and, incidentally, helped conquer that tropical disease all around the world.